The night everything came apart started so ordinary that I almost didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. Which is strange because ordinary is the last word anyone would use for what happened after. I live in a subdivision called Cinder Hollow, built into the dry hills above a town most maps don't bother naming twice, Two Forks, where the wind smells like sage and old creek beds. And the houses were put up fast. Cheap stucco stretched over what used to be scrubland nobody thought anyone would want. I'd moved there 11 months earlier after my husband, Callum, died into the house we'd bought together, when he still had 2 more years left in him, though neither of us knew that at the time. Callum had been a land surveyor, the kind of quiet, meticulous man who cared more about property lines and soil composition than almost anything else. And if you'd told me that obsession would end up being the reason a woman named Glynis Thorne kicked my front door off its hinges on a Tuesday night in March, I would have laughed you out of the room. But that's exactly what happened, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because the surface of this story is not even close to what was actually underneath it. And if you're the kind of person who likes staying until the very last thread gets pulled, do me a favor and hit subscribe before we get into the parts that made my hands shake while I was writing this down because, trust me, you're going to want to be here for what comes after the door. I was hosting a dinner that night. Nothing fancy, just my brother-in-law, Everett Bramwell, who happens to be the chief of police for the whole county, and who had been checking in on me every few weeks since Callum passed. Partly out of grief and, partly I'd later understand, out of something closer to duty. We were halfway through a pot roast when I heard the frame of my front door splinter. Not knock, not doorbell, splinter. And Glynis Thorne walked into my house like she owned the deed to it, clipboard in hand, insisting she had reasonable cause to conduct a surprise inspection under Cinder Hollow's bylaws regarding unauthorized structural modifications. I want to be clear that Glynis was not some cartoon Karen shrieking about mailbox colors. She was precise, rehearsed, almost clinical in the way she moved through my living room. And it was only when she rounded the corner into my dining room and saw Everett's uniform draped over the back of a chair, badge catching the light, that something in her face genuinely cracked for half a second before she smoothed it back over. She apologized, said she hadn't realized I had company, and left almost too quickly, which should have been the end of it. The funny little anecdote about the HOA president who picked the wrong house to raid. Everett didn't think so. He sat back down, didn't touch his food, and asked me very quietly whether Glynis had ever asked to see the crawl space, or the garage, or anything of Callum's I still hadn't gone through. That question sat with me for days because the truth is, Glynis had asked more than once, always dressed up as some bylaw technicality, always circling back to the detached workshop where Callum kept his old survey equipment. Everett eventually told me something I hadn't known, which was that over the previous 8 months 4 other households in Cinder Hollow had reported nearly identical incidents. HOA inspections that always seemed to target garages, storage units, anywhere someone might keep old paperwork. And every single one of those households belonged to people who had lived in Cinder Hollow before it was Cinder Hollow, back when the land was designated as part of a native seed conservation trust that Callum, in his last working year, had been quietly resurveying because the boundary markers didn't match the county's official filings. He never told me what he found. He died 3 weeks after that survey job, wrapped in what the county ruled a single vehicle accident, on a road he'd driven 1,000 times, sober and careful. And I had grieved it as exactly that, an accident, until Everett sat across from me with his untouched pot roast and said the words I still hear sometimes late at night, that he'd never been entirely comfortable closing that file. What unraveled after that dinner wasn't a courtroom drama with a tidy verdict. It was something slower and far more surgical because Everett didn't move on instinct alone. He moved with a state land fraud task force that, as it turned out, had already been building a case against the original Cinder Hollow developer for over a year. A case that had stalled because they were missing physical documentation tying the falsified county filings to anyone still living and reachable. Glynis Thorne, it turned out, wasn't simply an overzealous HOA president drunk on borrowed authority. She was the developer's sister-in-law, and she had been installed as HOA president specifically to manage the fallout if the original land trust boundaries ever resurfaced, which meant every single one of those surprise inspections over 8 months had been a deliberate, coordinated search for Callum's missing survey files. Files she believed I either had or would eventually stumble onto in his workshop. The dinner where she kicked my door in wasn't the beginning of the investigation catching up to her. It was the moment her own panic finally handed investigators the one thing they'd been missing, because in her rush to search my house in front of a county police chief, she'd violated 3 separate statutes in under 4 minutes. Forced entry, unauthorized search without consent or warrant, and destruction of private property. All of it captured on a home security system Everett had quietly asked me to install 2 months earlier. A detail I hadn't questioned at the time because I assumed it was simple grief-driven overprotectiveness from a man who'd lost his brother. What followed over the next several months was not some fast, satisfying gavel-bang ending. It was a slow, total dismantling because once investigators had legal grounds to formally search Glynis's own property, they found not just Callum's missing files, which he had apparently mailed to himself as insurance, and which she had intercepted from an unsecured community mailroom she controlled as HOA president. But a decade of falsified land surveys, forged conservation releases, and financial records showing she and the developer had been quietly siphoning HOA reserve funds to pay off two different county officials to keep the trust land boundary dispute buried. The Seed Conservation Trust, once fully reinstated by the state using Callum's original survey work as the deciding evidence, didn't just void the HOA's authority, it voided ownership claims on nearly a third of Cinder Hollow itself, including, in a detail I still find almost unbearably fitting, Glynis Thorne's own house, which sat squarely inside the reclaimed trust boundary and was seized along with everything else. She wasn't simply arrested, though she was on charges spanning fraud, conspiracy, and criminal trespass. She was financially wiped out in a civil judgment that stripped every asset tied to the scheme. Her name was permanently barred from serving on any homeowners association or property board in the state, and as part of her sentencing, she was ordered into hundreds of hours of supervised labor, restoring the very native seedbeds she'd spent a decade trying to bury under stucco and property lines. Meaning the woman who once kicked down my door with a clipboard now spends her mornings on her knees in the dirt of the land she tried to steal, watched over by rangers, while the rest of Cinder Hollow quietly reorganizes itself without an HOA at all, because there's nothing left to preside over. Callum never got to see any of it, and some nights that's the part that still catches in my throat more than anything Glynis did. But I think he'd have found some grim satisfaction in knowing the ground told the truth even after everyone standing on it tried to bury it. And if this story meant something to you, if you want to be here when I tell you whatever it found in that mailroom ledger that I still haven't fully talked about, stick around. Drop a comment telling me which twist actually got you, and subscribe because there's more of this story I haven't told yet.